The December night of 1944 fell over the Lorraine region of northeastern France like a heavy, impenetrable curtain. The cold bit the men of the U.S. Army's 3rd Armored Division, camped just a few miles from the German border. Snow was beginning to cover the muddy roads, and the distant sound of diesel engines echoed among the wooded hills. It was a winter that tested not only the soldiers' endurance, but the efficiency of an entire war machine dependent on one thing: fuel. In that theater of operations, every liter of gasoline meant kilometers of advance. Every drum of diesel represented the difference between mobility and paralysis. Allied supply lines were stretched to the limit. Since the Normandy landings in June of that year, American forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Europe, liberating cities, driving back German forces, and pushing the war back into the heart of the Reich. But this rapid advance came at a hidden price. Fuel was not arriving quickly enough. Supply trucks traveled daytime routes established by the Army Transportation Command, following strict protocols that prioritized safety over efficiency. Convoys departed at dawn, stopped for inspections every 20 kilometers, avoided secondary roads, and returned before dusk. It was a logical system, tested in military doctrine manuals, approved by generals who had never driven a loaded truck on war-torn roads. The problem was simple: this system was failing. Frontline Sherman tanks spent entire days idle, awaiting resupply. Self-propelled artillery units received half their required supplies. Reconnaissance jeeps departed with half-full tanks. And meanwhile, across the border, German forces reorganized their defenses, preparing for what would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, the Wehrmacht's last major thrust on the Western Front. It was in this context that one man realized something no one else had considered. He wasn't a general. He wasn't involved in strategic planning, and he had no authority to question the system. He was simply a heavy-duty truck driver, responsible for transporting fuel drums from forward supply base Delta, near Metz, to distribution points near Saarbrücken. His name was Thomas Edwin Callahan, a native of a small farming town in rural Kansas. Before the war, he worked as a commercial truck driver, hauling grain and farm machinery across the plains of the American Midwest. He knew roads like other men knew maps. He was 32 years old, with brown hair always covered by a worn wool cap, and a calculating gaze that analyzed every curve, every slope, every change in terrain, as if he were solving a silent mathematical equation. Callahan didn't talk much. His unit mates considered him distant, almost too introspective for the noisy, chaotic environment of a military camp, but he observed everything, and what he observed made no sense. Every morning, dozens of trucks departed the supply base following the same route, the main road, passing 4 checkpoints, crossing 2 inspected bridges, and returning before sunset. The entire trip took 14 hours, including mandatory stops. The average fuel consumption per truck was 120 liters, but what intrigued Callahan wasn't the distance traveled, but how it was covered. The daytime route forced drivers to climb and descend unnecessary hills, constantly accelerate and brake, due to heavy traffic from other military vehicles, and wait in endless lines at checkpoints. All of this consumed fuel exponentially. Callahan calculated mentally. Each sudden stop wasted half a liter. Each forced climb in 3rd gear consumed twice as much as necessary. Each prolonged stop kept the engine idling, burning diesel fuel without producing any movement. And then he realized something that would change everything. There was another route, a secondary, less traveled road that skirted the hills rather than through them. It passed through natural valleys, followed the bed of old wagon trails, and avoided the congestion of the main arteries. But there was one crucial detail: it was only safe at night. During the day, that road was vulnerable. Without constant air cover, without regular patrols, it was exposed to possible attacks from German scouts still operating in the region. Army manuals explicitly prohibited the use of unauthorized routes, especially after dark. The logic was clear. Losing a truck to the enemy was worse than delaying a delivery. But Callahan saw another logic. The war couldn't wait. And if there was a way to deliver more fuel faster and consume fewer resources in the process, then the question wasn't whether it should be done, but how to do it without being intercepted. He began to study the night route in secret. He borrowed topographic maps from the planning office when no one was looking. He spoke discreetly with soldiers who had patrolled the area, gathering information about the terrain, the times when enemy activity decreased, the points where the road became invisible from above, and he calculated. If he drove slowly enough to keep the engine at optimum RPM, if he anticipated each curve to avoid braking, if he used the inertia of the slopes to save acceleration on the following climbs, he could reduce his fuel consumption by somewhere between 30 and 40%. This wasn't a rough estimate. It was pure mathematics applied to the physics of motion, but there was a bigger problem than any calculation could solve. Doing so meant disobeying direct orders. It meant putting at risk not only his own life, but the cargo he was transporting, the military vehicle under his responsibility, and potentially the entire supply operation he was part of. If he were discovered, he would face court-martial. If he failed, he would be held responsible for wasting critical wartime resources. Thomas Callahan wasn't reckless, he wasn't rebellious, but he was deeply rational. And rationality told him one thing: the war would be won or lost, not by the soldiers who fired, but by the men who made sure those soldiers had something to fire with. The decision was made. He would take the night route. The first attempt took place on a moonless night, 3 days before Christmas in 1944. Thomas Callahan waited until the last official convoy returned to Forward Supply Base Delta, watching from the cab of his 2.5-ton GMC CCKW truck as the other drivers unloaded, filed reports, and headed for their tents. The sergeant in charge of the fuel depot had gone out to dinner. The night guards made their rounds at predictable intervals. It was time. He didn't fully load the truck. That would have been too suspicious. Instead, he loaded it with 24 200-liter drums of aviation gasoline, officially destined for a morning delivery to the Advanced Air Base near Saarlouis. He dated the shipment on the manifest for the next day, but signed as if he were simply preparing the vehicle for a dawn departure, a simple paperwork trick that would give him 12 hours of leeway before anyone noticed his absence. The truck's diesel engine rumbled softly as he turned the key. Callahan adjusted his rearview mirrors, mentally checked his tire pressure by the sound they made against the gravel, and headed for the base's south gate, the least trafficked one. The guard, a young soldier from Ohio, barely 20, waved sleepily without checking his documents. It was routine. No one questioned a truck leaving empty for a nighttime maintenance mission, but the truck was not empty, and it was not going for maintenance. Callahan followed the main road for exactly 5 miles, until he reached the point where an old country road veered southeast. There, without turning on his brake lights to avoid attracting attention, he turned onto the secondary road he'd studied on maps. From that moment on, he was officially off course, off protocol, off any acceptable military cover or justification. The darkness was complete. He drove with his lights off, relying only on the residual light of the stars and the photographic memory he'd developed from topographic maps. The dirt road descended gently through a valley between 2 wooded hills, following the course of a frozen stream that glowed faintly in the starlight. The silence was broken only by the steady roar of the engine and the occasional crunch of dry twigs under the tires. He kept his speed between 20 and 40 miles per hour, never faster. Constant speed meant constant engine speed, which meant constant and predictable fuel consumption. Every variation wasted energy. Every sudden acceleration burned diesel unnecessarily. Callahan drove as if he were conducting a living calculation where every movement had a measurable consequence. The first climb tested his theory. On the official route, drivers would shift into low gear and accelerate hard to conquer the inclines. They consumed twice as much fuel and overloaded their engines. Callahan did something different. He began accelerating gently on the previous descent, using the accumulated inertia to gain momentum. By the time he reached the base of the climb, he was already at 30 miles per hour. He downshifted to 4th gear without straining the engine, kept the throttle steady, and let the vehicle's own weight and momentum do the work. The truck climbed the hill using 40% less fuel than it would have using the conventional method. He smiled softly in the darkness. The math worked, but the math didn't account for fear, and fear arrived in the form of a distant sound, the unmistakable metallic rumble of tank tracks moving somewhere to the north. Callahan immediately cut the engine and lay still inside the cabin, breathing controlled, all senses on high alert. The sound persisted for perhaps 3 minutes, then gradually receded until it disappeared completely. It could have been an American tank on night patrol. It could have been a German panzer conducting reconnaissance. There was no way of knowing. He waited another 10 minutes before restarting the engine. Every second of waiting was an extra second of risk of discovery, but every second of haste was a second less of caution. Callahan wasn't in a hurry. He was methodical. The route continued through a small fir forest that the artillery had not yet reached. The trees formed a natural tunnel that completely obscured the route from above, making it invisible to any reconnaissance aircraft, friendly or enemy. It was there that he noticed another unexpected benefit: protection from the wind. On the official route, the trucks faced constant lateral gusts that forced the drivers to make frequent steering adjustments, each one consuming a little more fuel. There, between the trees, the air was almost still. After 4 hours of night driving, Callahan reached the drop-off point, a makeshift U.S. Air Force forward depot, set up in an old stone barn 2 miles outside Saarlouis. 2 night-shift mechanics were servicing a generator when the truck emerged from the darkness. They instinctively raised their rifles before recognizing the Allied markings on the vehicle. One of them, a Boston corporal with a thick accent, walked up to the booth. "Where did you come from? There was no delivery scheduled until tomorrow morning." Callahan stepped out of the truck with measured calm. "Change of plans. Do you need this now, or can it wait?" The mechanic glanced at the drums of aviation fuel in the back of the truck, then at Callahan's expressionless face. There was something about the driver's demeanor that discouraged further questions. "We need it now. We have 6 fighter jets that have been grounded for 2 days due to fuel shortages." It took 40 minutes to unload the 24 drums. Callahan helped silently, moving each 200-liter drum with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. When they were finished, the corporal offered hot coffee from a thermos. Callahan accepted, sipped slowly, and then asked a question that seemed casual but wasn't. "How many times a week do you run out of gas?" 3, maybe 4 times. The supply system is broken. It's not the driver's fault, but deliveries never arrive when we need them." Callahan nodded slowly, then climbed back into the truck. "This one's here." The return journey was quicker. Without a load, the vehicle consumed even less fuel. He arrived at Forward Supply Base Delta 2 hours before dawn, parked the truck in the same spot he'd left, and walked to his tent as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But before going to sleep, he did something meticulous. He recorded every kilometer traveled, every liter consumed, every minute spent on each leg of the route. The trip had consumed 72 liters of fuel. The same delivery via the official route would consume 120 liters, a savings of 40%. Exactly as he had calculated, but numbers meant nothing if they couldn't be repeated. Callahan knew that a single successful voyage was luck. 10 successful voyages were a pattern, and patterns could change wars. He closed his eyes but didn't sleep soundly. His mind was already planning the next night's route. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas Callahan established a routine that defied all conventional military logic. Every 3 nights he repeated the journey along the secondary route, always with different loads, always to slightly different destinations, but always following the same fundamental principle: constant speed, terrain anticipation, and the use of inertia. He never failed. He was never intercepted, and he never consumed more than 75% of the fuel the official route would have required. The mechanics and supply sergeants at the forward bases began to notice a strange pattern. Deliveries that were supposed to arrive only at dawn mysteriously appeared in the wee hours. Fuel scheduled for the next day appeared hours ahead of schedule. No one complained. In a war where every hour of delay could mean the difference between mobility and paralysis, early deliveries were greeted as small, silent miracles. But Callahan wasn't performing miracles. He was performing applied mathematics under extreme conditions. The problem arose in mid-January 1945, when a transportation command major named Richard Ashford began reviewing fuel consumption reports for the entire Lorraine region. Ashford was a methodical man, a pre-war engineering graduate from the University of Michigan, and had a disturbing talent for spotting anomalies in seemingly normal data, and there was a glaring anomaly in the records at Advanced Supply Base Delta. Callahan's truck was consuming 40% less fuel than any other vehicle in the same class on comparable routes. Initially, Ashford suspected a recording error. Then, he suspected fraudulent reporting, but when he cross-referenced the data with delivery records at final destinations, he discovered something even more intriguing. Not only was fuel consumption lower, but deliveries were happening faster. Hours faster. The summons arrived on a frigid January morning. Callahan was instructed to report to base headquarters, in a makeshift room where Ashford had arranged 3 stacks of documents on a rough wooden table. The meeting began not with accusations, but with technical questions about previous experience, length of service, and knowledge of automotive mechanics. Callahan answered precisely, without elaborating beyond what was necessary. He had driven commercial trucks for 8 years before the war, knew diesel engines like other men knew guns, and understood the physics of motion because his survival on the Kansas roads had depended on it. Ashford then presented the numbers. A 40% reduction in consumption, deliveries several hours ahead of schedule. No formal violations recorded, but a pattern impossible to explain by conventional methods. The conclusion was inescapable. Callahan was using an unauthorized route. There was no point in denying it. Callahan confirmed everything, and when prompted walked to the table where a topographic map lay open. He traced with his finger the secondary road he had used, explaining each technical decision without emotion or moral justification. The valley that reduced wind resistance, the sequence of elevations that allowed for the use of kinetic momentum, the nighttime hours that eliminated traffic and allowed for a constant speed. 15 minutes of explanation that transformed disobedience into a dissertation on applied engineering. Ashford listened without interrupting. When Callahan finished, the Major remained silent for what seemed like an interminable amount of time, studying the map, then the reports, then the expressionless face of the driver in front of him. There was something here the military manuals hadn't anticipated: individual initiative based on superior technical knowledge, executed with precision that eliminated the risks that justified the original prohibitions. The Major opened a second folder. Inside was a recent directive from High Command, requesting proposals for reducing fuel consumption in supply operations. 17 reports had already been submitted by logistics officers from across the European theater. All suggested bureaucratic adjustments, reconfiguration of control points, better scheduling, additional training. None suggested what Callahan had done, because none of them had been written by anyone who actually drove the trucks. Ashford pushed a blank piece of paper across the table. The order was straightforward: document everything within 72 hours, every detail of the route, every driving technique, every variable considered. A comprehensive report that could be evaluated by military engineers and potentially transformed into new transportation doctrine. The implicit alternative didn't need to be verbalized. If the method could be successfully replicated by other drivers, Callahan would have changed the system. If he failed, disobedience of orders would be dealt with by court-martial. Callahan accepted the paper and returned to his tent with a strange feeling. For weeks he had operated in the shadows, convinced of the correctness of his calculations, but unable to validate them beyond his own observations. Now, for the first time, someone with institutional authority was willing to consider that the established rules might be wrong, and that a Kansas driver might have discovered something generations of logistics officers had missed. He began writing that very night. He didn't write like a soldier following a bureaucratic order. He wrote like an engineer documenting a repeatable scientific experiment. The report grew organically, page after page of technical analysis. Topographic maps were copied and annotated with elevation gradients. Fuel consumption tables were constructed comparing the official route with the secondary route in different weather conditions. Diagrams showed approach angles on climbs, braking distances on descents, and moment calculations based on load weight. Every kilometer was mapped. Every liter was accounted for. Every decision was justified not by instinct, but by consistently applied elementary physics. The final document was 12 handwritten pages long, dense with technical information and practical observations accumulated over more than 20 successful overnight trips. When Callahan delivered the report 3 days later, Ashford read it silently for nearly a full hour, occasionally turning back pages to check a calculation or diagram. The Major made notes in the margins, circled certain passages, and drew question marks next to others. Finally, he closed the document and placed it inside a sealed envelope destined for the European Theater Transportation Command. What Callahan had produced was not simply a field report. It was an implicit proposal for doctrinal change, written by someone with no formal authority to propose such changes, but with practical knowledge no cabinet officer possessed. If the command's engineers accepted the conclusions, the entire nighttime transportation system could be redesigned. Routes would be recalculated, drivers would be retrained, theater-scale fuel savings could reach millions of gallons per month. But if they rejected it, Callahan had just formally documented months of deliberate violations of wartime military protocol. Ashford informed him that a response would take at least 2 weeks. In the meantime, Callahan was to suspend night routes and return to conventional operations. It was a direct, non-negotiable order. The driver returned to official routes without protest, driving during the day, stopping at mandatory checkpoints, and consuming the statutory 120 litres per trip. But every wasted litre now seemed an offence against logic. Every hour lost in traffic jams, a reminder that efficiency and bureaucracy rarely shared the same path. He didn't know if he would be decorated or condemned, but he knew he had proven his point in the only language war truly understood: measurable, repeatable results. The European Theatre Transportation Command's response arrived 19 days later, not in the form of an official letter, but through 3 engineering officers who showed up at Forward Supply Base Delta on a grey February morning. They hadn't come to interrogate Callahan. They had come to have him personally guide them along the night route he documented. They wanted to see for themselves whether the math on paper matched the reality on the road. The test took place on a snowless night, with temperatures below freezing and moderate visibility. Callahan drove the truck loaded with 24 drums of fuel, while the 3 officers alternated in the passenger seat, each taking detailed notes in field notebooks, illuminated by flashlights covered with red cloth. They measured everything: engine RPM on different stretches, fuel consumption every 10 kilometers, the exact time spent on each segment of the route, oil temperature, brake pressure. They turned the trip into a silent, technical audit. Callahan drove exactly as he had on previous trips, a constant speed of between 35 and 40 kilometers per hour, 20 and 25 minutes mehr. He anticipated every curve to avoid braking. He took advantage of downhill slopes to build momentum before climbing. He used inertia as a tool for economy. He didn't change anything to impress the observers, because to do so would invalidate the data he had already presented. Consistency was his only defense. The entire trip took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Total consumption was 73 litres. The officers checked the numbers 3 times before one of them, an engineering captain named Morris, allowed himself a brief comment. Impressive, just that word, no elaboration. But it was loaded with meaning. Military engineers didn't use superlatives lightly. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 more drivers were selected to train with Callahan. They weren't volunteers. They were the best heavy-duty vehicle operators available in the Lorraine region, men with thousands of miles logged, experience in harsh conditions, and impeccable maintenance and safety records. If Callahan's technique could be taught, these men would be able to learn it. If it couldn't, then it was merely the singular talent of one individual, impossible to scale across an entire fleet. The training began with theory. Callahan explained the fundamental physical principles, not as a professor, but as someone sharing practical knowledge accumulated over years on the road. Momentum and inertia, optimal engine speed for maximum efficiency, perception distance versus reaction distance in low visibility conditions, terrain reading through topographic maps. Each concept was presented not as an academic abstraction, but as a tool for survival and efficiency. Then came the supervised trips. Each driver made the night route at least 4 times, always with Callahan in the passenger seat, correcting subtle errors, pointing out missed opportunities for economy, and teaching how to anticipate the vehicle's behavior in different types of terrain. One of them, a sergeant from Tennessee who had driven mining trucks before the war, grasped the principles immediately. Another, younger and less experienced, needed 7 trips before the movements became second nature, rather than conscious. But they all succeeded. They all replicated the 35 to 42% fuel consumption reduction. Individual variations were expected, resulting from differences in body weight, personal driving style, and terrain reading ability. But the average remained consistent. The method worked. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was a reproducible technique based on sound physics principles and careful observation. Test reports were compiled and sent to higher command levels. Callahan did not have access to the final documents, but he could infer their content from what happened next. In March 1945, 3 months after his first unauthorized night trips, a new directive was issued by Transportation Command for the entire European theater. The directive did not mention Callahan by name. Military documents rarely celebrate specific individuals in operational policies, but the content was unmistakable. Secondary routes previously classified as unsafe were re-evaluated and, when adequately mapped, authorized for nighttime use under specific conditions. Driving protocols were revised to include fuel conservation techniques based on inertia exploitation and maintaining a constant speed. Additional training was mandated for all heavy vehicle drivers, focusing on operational efficiency rather than just safety and maintenance. The system was changing, slowly, bureaucratically, but changing, and the change had begun with one man who decided that the established rules were costing the war more than they were protecting it. But not all the consequences were positive. By April, as Allied forces advanced deep into Germany and supply lines stretched further, fuel demand reached critical levels. Every litre saved meant an additional kilometre of advance. Night routes, now officially sanctioned, became not only permitted but expected. Drivers who had previously driven 8 hours a day now drove 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours, split between day and night shifts. Efficiency had become a new form of pressure. Callaghan watched this with mixed feelings. He had proven that it was possible to do more with less, but doing more with less eventually became just doing more. The math worked. The physics was sound, but humans weren't machines, and machines eventually broke down when operated beyond their designed limits. He felt the weight himself. Weeks of night driving, even efficient ones, took an invisible toll. The human body was not designed to operate in perpetual darkness, to maintain absolute concentration for hours on end, on roads where a miscalculation could mean an overturned truck, a lost load, or worse. Callaghan began having trouble sleeping during the day. The sounds of the camp, once easily ignored, became intrusive. His appetite diminished. Small tremors appeared in his hands when he parked after long drives. But war didn't wait for men to rest, and Callaghan wasn't one to complain. He'd started it. He'd proven it worked. Now he had to keep making it work because other drivers looked to him as a role model, as the man who had changed the system. To stop would mean admitting that the system he'd created was unsustainable, and he wasn't ready to admit that. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. German forces surrendered. Tanks stopped moving, not for lack of fuel, but because there was nowhere left to go. And for the first time in months, Thomas Callaghan drove a truck during the day at normal speed, stopping when he wanted to, without calculating every litre, without measuring every moment, without turning the road into a mathematical equation. The feeling was strange, as if I'd forgotten how to drive without thinking, as if efficiency had become a habit I couldn't shake. He never knew how many litres of fuel his techniques had saved in total. Millions, probably. Perhaps tens of millions when multiplied by all the drivers who adopted the methods. Numbers too large to be significant individually, but large enough to have changed, even marginally, the course of Allied logistics in the final months of the war. But what Callaghan remembered weren't the numbers. It was the sound of the diesel engine revving steadily, the faint glow of stars over deserted roads, the silence among the trees of the fir forest, the cold certainty that he was right, even when all the regulations said he was wrong, and the question he was never able to fully answer: did being right justify disobeying? In the months following the end of the war in Europe, the United States Army began a massive demobilization process. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers awaited transport home as the military machine that had consumed unimaginable resources began to slow down. But before the men could return, before the equipment was dismantled and shipped to depots or sold for scrap, there were reports to be written, post-conflict analyses, documentation of lessons learned. The bureaucracy of war didn't end with the last shot. It merely changed form. Thomas Callaghan was ordered to remain in Europe for 3 more months after the German surrender, not to lead, but to participate in a review commission on logistics operations. Officers from different branches of the military, civil engineers hired by the government, and industrial efficiency experts gathered in makeshift offices in Frankfurt to dissect what had worked and what had failed in the largest logistics effort in human history. Callaghan was the only private in the room. All the others held the rank of captain or higher, but he was there because his name appeared in reports that had been circulated to high command. He was the driver who had reduced fuel consumption by 40%, the man who had changed transportation doctrine through calculated disobedience. They wanted to hear from him not just about what he had done, but about why the system had failed to notice what seemed obvious to him earlier. The sessions were long and technically dense. Callaghan repeatedly described his techniques, answering questions from engineers trying to quantify every aspect of fuel economy. How much of the reduction came from route selection? How much from driving technique? How much was the result of specific terrain conditions that couldn't be replicated in other theaters of war? They wanted to turn intuition into a formula, experience into a manual, instinct into standardized procedures. He did his best to explain, but there were aspects that didn't fit into spreadsheets. The ability to read the terrain through small variations in engine sound, the tacit knowledge of when to accelerate half a second before a hill to take advantage of accumulated inertia, the subtle perception of how the vehicle would respond before it even responded. These things weren't irrational, but they weren't completely rationalizable either. They were the product of years on the road, of thousands of miles driven with constant attention, of an almost symbiotic relationship between operator and machine. One of the civil engineers, a man named Patterson who had worked for General Motors before the war, expressed frustration during one of the sessions. He wanted to create a training protocol that could transform any competent driver into a highly efficient operator in 6 weeks. Callahan patiently explained that 6 weeks would teach the principles, but not the instinct. Just as 6 weeks of shooting lessons would teach a soldier to hit static targets, but would not prepare him for fire decisions in real combat. Patterson wasn't satisfied with the answer. He wanted scalability. He wanted guaranteed results. He wanted to eliminate the human variable from the equation. Callahan understood the desire, but also understood its impossibility. Extreme efficiency required not only knowledge, but judgment. And judgment was precisely the quality that bureaucratic systems tried to minimize through regulations. There was a profound irony in this. Callahan had improved the system by ignoring it. Now they were trying to incorporate his improvement back into the system, but doing so required creating new regulations that would inevitably be too rigid to allow for the kind of situational adaptation that had made his voyages successful. They were trying to regulate the ability to ignore regulations when appropriate. It was logically impossible. During those months in Frankfurt, Callahan also gained access to documents previously above his security clearance, fuel consumption reports from across the European theater, analysis of supply line disruptions, studies of how logistical delays had impacted tactical operations at critical moments. The numbers were startling not for their magnitude, but for the precision with which they demonstrated something he had already suspected. Small inefficiencies, multiplied by thousands of vehicles operating daily for years, created massive deficits. One report in particular caught his attention. It was an analysis of the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, the last major German attack on the Western Front. The document examined why the Allied forces had initially been surprised and how the response had been coordinated. Buried in the technical sections was a note on how fuel shortages had delayed the redeployment of armored reserves during the critical first days of the offensive. Callahan read that section 3 times. The Ardennes offensive had begun on December 16th. Its first unauthorized night trips had begun on December 22nd, 6 days later. Had it started earlier? Had someone noticed the system's inefficiencies months earlier? Would it have made a difference? Could tanks that had been stranded for lack of fuel have reached critical points faster? How many hours of delay were caused by a transportation system that wasted 40% of the fuel it moved? There was no way to know. History offered no controlled experiments, but the possibility remained with him as an unanswered question. Perhaps nothing would have changed. Perhaps a few hours more or less would have been inconsequential in the scale of a battle involving hundreds of thousands of men. Or perhaps a few hours were everything. War was about narrow margins, small advantages accumulated, moments where having an extra tank in position meant holding a critical road or losing it. He would never know. And that uncertainty was, in some ways, heavier than any recognition he might have received. In August of 1945, the Commission completed its work. A final report of 240 pages was produced, containing dozens of recommendations for future logistical operations. An entire section was devoted to fuel conservation techniques in motorized transport, based directly on Callahan's observations and methods. His name appeared in footnotes, credited as the primary source of data. It wasn't glory, but it was permanent recognition that he had contributed something that would transcend the war. The report's recommendations were incorporated into U.S. Army doctrine manuals in the years that followed. Military drivers in future conflicts would be trained in fuel conservation techniques that traced their origins directly to the nights Callahan spent on the back roads of France. Alternative routes would be evaluated not only for safety, but also for operational efficiency. The concept that regulations should serve the mission, not the mission the regulations, would slowly but irreversibly gain institutional traction. Callahan was cleared to return to the United States in September. Before he left, Major Ashford, the engineer who had initially investigated his unauthorized routes, handed him a copy of the Commission's final report. There was no ceremony, just a silent acknowledgement that some contributions to the war came not from battlefields, but from decisions made quietly by men who saw problems and solved them, even when it meant defying authority. Days later, Callahan boarded a transport ship in the port of Le Havre, joining hundreds of other soldiers returning home. The journey across the Atlantic took 9 days. He spent most of his time on deck, watching the ocean, thinking about roads he would never drive again, decisions he could never undo, the strange legacy of having been right when the rules said he was wrong. The American coast appeared on the horizon on a clear September morning. Callahan disembarked in New York, processed his demobilization at Camp Kilmer, and received the documents that officially transformed him from soldier to veteran. He returned to Kansas on a train that crossed the country in 3 days, gazing out the window at the endless plains he had known before the war, now seeing them with different eyes. He returned to work as a commercial truck driver. The roads were the same, the vehicles were similar, but something fundamental had changed. Each trip now carried the silent weight of the knowledge that efficiency wasn't just about economy, but strategy. That small decisions repeated thousands of times created immeasurable impacts. That questioning authority when authority was wrong wasn't rebellion, but responsibility. Thomas Edwin Callahan never spoke publicly about his night routes. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't write memoirs. He lived for another 42 years after the war, driving trucks along the roads of the American Midwest, hauling grain and machinery, calculating routes with the same meticulous precision he had applied on the roads of France. He died in 1987, at the age of 75, in a small town in Kansas, where few knew he had changed military doctrine, but its legacy remains, in training manuals, in operational principles, in the way subsequent generations of military drivers learned to think of efficiency not as a luxury, but as a tactical imperative. War teaches brutal lessons, but occasionally it also teaches that courage comes not just from facing the enemy, but from questioning the system when it fails. Callahan's story is a reminder that great victories are built on thousands of small, correct decisions. That innovation often comes not from planning offices, but from those who do the work. That rules exist to serve purposes, and when they no longer serve, they must be challenged. And that sometimes the most strategic thing anyone can do is simply think clearly and act accordingly, no matter what the textbooks say. If this story about silent decisions that changed the course of war logistics made you reflect on how small efficiencies can have big impacts, leave your opinion in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories of military ingenuity and technical courage that rarely appear in history books. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories of men who won wars not with weapons, but with intelligence, precision, and the courage to do what was right even when it was forbidden.